I'm Laure Hogan, and until recently, in April of 2009, I was Vice President of Program for the California Endowment. The California Endowment is a health foundation here in California, funding both health and health care issues in California, and have always focused on issues of cultural competency and have had a lot of grantees and grant initiatives that intersected with immigration and immigrant populations, because in California really you cannot make progress to improve anything about health in a state as diverse as California without understanding and being deeply involved in immigration issues. I first became involved with GCIR back in 2001. They asked me to help participate in planning for the convening that GCIR puts on every 2 years. And this particular convening was happening in San Diego, here in California, so the California Endowment was happy to become part of that and really get involved in some of the program content, suggesting grantees and other speakers for the convening. And boy, there was never any looking back after that point of involvement with GCIR. I found the staff and the resources at GCIR to be just a daily use in my work. And I think some of the things that made that happen, that were part of the experience from that first planning conference, were the strong combination of program content and relationship building that GCIR is so good at. And so part of what was involved in planning that conference was actually a trip to Las Vegas, where a group of us who were on the planning committee went to Las Vegas. Frankly, never saw much of the gambling or the glitz of Las Vegas, but was way more interesting for me than that view would have been, because we were in the back rooms of hotels. We were looking at Las Vegas from the point of view of an immigrant worker and what it felt like to be part of that industry, but very much in the background, in the back room, the laundry rooms, the kitchens, and the other aspects of the service industry that support all of the bright lights that happen. And one of the things on that visit that was very compelling was the relationship between unions and the hotels and immigrant populations who were newcomers to Las Vegas. They were finding themselves part of wave after wave of different kinds of immigrant groups coming to Las Vegas, who not only didn't particularly speak English very well, that they really had no experience of what it would be like to work in this country, what their rights were, but also what their responsibilities were. And so the hotels and the unions and some immigrant serving organizations teamed up to really produce a great entree into the work world here for those different refugee populations that were coming. And, you know, did you get sick leave or not, and how to call your boss if you weren't able to come to work that day, and just how to maneuver and navigate through the work world here in the United States as you're part of also integrating yourself into the culture of the United States. It seems such a wonderful, positive view of how the United States can receive newcomer populations and do a good job of that. And yet it involved all the big players. This was not just the grassroots organizations, but unions and big hotel chains who were equally invested in whether the newcomer populations did well. I remember one specific initiative at the California Endowment that we engaged in that without GCIR really would not have had the power that it had. We understood that a wave of camps were closing in Thailand. The final camps in Thailand were closing that were housing Hmong refugees. And this was a group of folks who had been in camps for a very long time. They were coming to the United States. And I think there was the idea that there was a Hmong population in some parts of California that would be there to help integrate the newer refugees and really pave the way for them. Those organizations were feeling quite nervous about this huge number of recent refugees that would come to the country, because they themselves were barely stable, had barely begun to feel a part of the new culture that they were in, and didn't really feel prepared to take on the thousands of new Hmong refugees and the overwhelming needs that they would have. And so the endowment designed an initiative going to some of the direct serving organizations in the Sacramento and Central Valley area in California to try to build up the capacity of those existing organizations for how they were going to help with these new refugees coming in. And these were all direct service organizations, and so their capacity was quite small. They were small staff. They were living on shoestring budgets. And GCIR brought in a wealth of resources and understanding, both research about program strategies that would be useful, specific information for those organizations about how they could build their capacity in a culturally competent way, really helped the California Endowment design something that would be useful to those organizations. And in fact, it was so beneficial that there was a second wave of this initiative after a few years that moved the direct service organizations into an advocacy and policy stance. They all had great things to offer in terms of what was needed on a policy front to help newcomer populations settle more easily in this country, but they didn't particularly have a voice for that policy stance, and they didn't, I think, even recognize that they had policy recommendations that they were making as part of their service learning. And so again, GCIR was part of us designing the second wave of that initiative to really begin to train and help direct service organizations understand how much they had to say about policy and how helpful they could be to state and county and even federal agencies as those agencies were designing their own program initiatives and thinking about how some of the policies they had in place actually created barriers to newcomer populations being integrated easily into the culture. So what I think is really remarkable about GCIR, there are lots of foundation affinity groups around, and they each have their role to play. I've remained involved in GCIR because I think it's really an affinity group par excellence and kind of the model for an affinity group. And that's because the staff at GCIR, it's a small staff, but it's a content deep staff. They really understand both what a foundation needs in order to design a program, what kinds of resources a foundation is looking for, and also how to nudge forward a foundation to expose the staff in a foundation to new ideas in the issue, to national level spokespeople in the issue, and to whatever the emerging trends and data and policy areas for that particular topic might be. So on the topic of immigrants and immigration and refugees in particular, GCIR's convenings are full of interesting workshops, but their website is full on a daily basis of recently published papers, specific examples of data that is coming out about migration, about new refugee populations that either have been here and what is happening to them over time, or who are coming to this country in greater numbers, who are the newer newcomer populations. And then lots of information about traditional immigrant populations. For California, those Latinos, but also Russian-speaking populations and Asian and South Asian populations. So how do we do a good job of supporting the continuing success of those established populations as we look to the new waves of newcomer populations? So going forward, I think GCIR is going to become even a greater resource for foundations as immigrant populations spread across the United States, and as we really grapple in this next period of time with immigration reform and how we can bring a positive slant to receiving immigrant communities more seamlessly into the United States, and to understand how we can bolster their continued community strength and their attachment to their culture that they have in their community while they become part of the United States, and as they integrate into and learn the wonderful positive parts that the United States culture has to offer for them.